One of the things that fascinated me the most about this episode in our local history is all of the legends, myths, and half-truths associated with it. So I hope sincerely, and we'll have some time to talk about these things afterwards, I hope sincerely that I don't burst too many bubbles in the room here. Because the heat was oppressive, and perhaps because the dinner and drink sat heavy in his gut, John Jouett Jr. curled up beneath the great elm in the yard at Cuckoo Tavern to catch a few winks. Jouett's sleeping spot was alongside the tavern's picket fence, the only thing that separated him from the mountain road. Despite the revelry droning on in the background, Jack, as his friends called him, was soon fast asleep. It was the moonlit evening of June 3rd, 1781, a Sunday. The American Revolution was in its 7th spring. Now Central Virginia would witness some of the war's most harrowing moments. Startled awake at 10 p.m., Jouett peered into the moonlight toward the steadily approaching clatter. The sight was absolutely terrifying. A 250-man British raiding party that filled the dusty roadway for 200 yards. At the head trotted green-jacketed horsemen whose very name had grown infamous. They were the British Legion. And you know, I completely forgot, I have PowerPoint. Before I get too far ahead and then have to backtrack. This is the only known image of Jack Jouett, a silhouette. That's the site of Cuckoo Tavern. Cuckoo. The British Legion. They were the British Legion. Loyalists from New Jersey, Philadelphia, and New York City. Hardened Americans who had sworn allegiance to King George. At the Battle of Waxhaw, South Carolina, in May of 1780, these cavalrymen, sabers slashing, had hacked their way through Virginia Continentals attempting to surrender. Dozens were massacred. There's that attack. Bobbing alongside the vanguard was the Legion's leader, the British commander at Waxhaws, Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton, a 26-year-old Liverpudlian who had risen in the ranks thanks to fast riding, hard fighting, and a ruthlessly aggressive nature. I think he might be, okay, there's Jack Jouett. There he is. To the Americans, this Green Dragoon was a butcher, bloody band. And since Waxhaws, the cry, Tarleton's Quarter, had become a patriot rallying cry. It meant death to enemy troops with their hands in the air. To the British, however, Banastre Tarleton was a capital horseman, the very model of a partisan leader. Jouett instantly surmised Tarleton's destination. The road fronting Cuckoo ran northwesterly to Louisa Courthouse, then onward to the gap in the southwest mountains at Pantops, a distance of 40 miles. Just beyond sat the previously unimportant backwater town of Charlottesville. Definitely backwater. Now, however, Charlottesville was serving as the temporary state capital because 3 weeks earlier, at the approach of the enemy, the entire government, both houses of the legislature and Governor Thomas Jefferson, had fled Richmond for points west. This Jack knew because his father, John Jouett Sr., was the proprietor of Charlottesville's Swan Tavern, just across from the courthouse. And of course, that's repetitive. I didn't need to say it was just across from the courthouse. In Virginia, if you have a courthouse, there's a tavern just across the street from it. Everywhere in Virginia. At that very moment, no doubt, a number of the unsuspecting assemblymen were sampling Jouett Sr.'s fare. Let's see what else we got here. There's a young Mr. Jefferson. Site of the Swan Tavern, of course, across from the courthouse. Inflamed by the sight of the enemy, Jack Jouett's thoughts must have raced. Could he beat Tarleton to Charlottesville? Could he get around him? Was his horse up to the challenge? Understanding the dire circumstances, Jack Jouett quickly determined to risk his life in an attempt to thwart one of his country's most despised and feared enemy commanders. Okay, before this next paragraph, do I have anybody from Massachusetts? Do I have any Bostonians? Okay, I might upset some Bostonians in this next paragraph. You know what I'm getting at. Unlike the legendary Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, much celebrated in poetry, painting, and even U.S. postage stamps, Jack Jouett's overnight race from Cuckoo to Charlottesville remains relatively obscure. Perhaps it's because Jouett, unlike Revere, was not already famous or well-to-do when he performed his heroic feat. And perhaps it's because Jack Jouett, after the war, sought his fortune out on the newspaper-sparse frontier, away from the centers of population and publicity. Whatever the reason, however, okay, here comes the sentence. The Central Virginian's desperate dash under the light of scrutiny far outshines the Bostonians. I am a Virginian, after all. Revere rode 15 miles, while Jouett rode 40, or perhaps even a bit further. Moreover, in Virginia, the stakes were higher. The state's Civil War leadership, in its entirety, was seemingly Tarleton's for the taking. What's most remarkable about this entire episode, to me, is that the Old Dominion, supposedly the country's most powerful state, had buckled so quickly under the enemy's blows, and that the entire administration was skedaddling like a flock of frightened geese. How had the situation gotten so grim? Amazingly, for the war's first 6 years, Virginia, by far the most populous state, remained relatively unscathed. Oh, here we go. That changed quickly during the 6 months between December of 1780 and June of 1781. Coincidentally, the last 6 months of Jefferson's second one-year gubernatorial term. On December 30th, 1780, the traitor Benedict Arnold, now an enemy general, sailed up the James River with 1,800 men aboard 27 British warships. The new capital at Richmond, with its military supplies and tobacco-packed warehouses, was the obvious target. When the general panic set in, the governor fled from the city with his family in the early morning hours of January 5th, an action occasioning charges of cowardice that plagued Jefferson throughout his political career. Somebody asked me about this afterwards, and I'll tell you some more about that. It's fascinating. Arnold captured the city that afternoon. 2 weeks later, after much burning and looting at Richmond and along the James, Arnold sailed downstream to Portsmouth and dug in. Meanwhile, all across Virginia, I caught it. Meanwhile, all across Virginia, county lieutenants desperately attempted to muster their militiamen. Too few turned out. 2 months later, a British fleet landed over 2,000 reinforcements at Portsmouth. Over the course of April, the British launched a number of raids, and actions were fought all along the James, including a battle at Blandford, near Petersburg, and a one-sided naval contest at Osborne's. There, on the 27th, the entire Virginia Navy was lost, including, perhaps prophetically, the Jefferson, which was scuttled. When the British again advanced against Richmond on April 30th, the capital was rescued at the 11th hour by Major General Marquis de Lafayette at the head, there he is, at the head of 900 Northern Continentals dispatched from George Washington's army. For the next month, this force, augmented by some 1,500 Virginia militiamen, was the largest the Old Dominion could muster. When General Charles Lord Cornwallis marched into Virginia from North Carolina with 1,500 additional British soldiers and another 1,500 arrived by sea, the 24-year-old Lafayette was suddenly greatly outnumbered, 3-1. And the new leader, Cornwallis, was an experienced and aggressive officer. In the course of but a few months, Virginia had become the war's most active theater of operations. There's Cornwallis. Should have stayed away from the beer, huh? Cornwallis was not an aristocratic dilettante, said Andrew O'Shaughnessy. He was a real military professional. He was also a gambler, someone willing to take major risks. He essentially wanted to make Virginia collapse. Surprisingly, the Old Dominion seemed willing to acquiesce. On May 10th, because of the deteriorating military situation, the Virginia legislature determined to quit the state capital and reconvene in Charlottesville beyond the Southwest Mountains. And with that, if that were only vodka. Lafayette also abandoned Richmond when Cornwallis advanced a few weeks later. Frustrated at his inability to ensnare Lafayette, whom Cornwallis called the aspiring boy, the 43-year-old Britisher decided instead to raid into Virginia's interior. Knowing that the governor and the legislature had fled to Charlottesville, this according to Tarleton in 1787, and knowing that from that point they'd call out more state troops, Cornwallis ordered Tarleton, the brilliant and brutal cavalryman, to frustrate these intentions and to distress the Americans by breaking up the Virginia Assembly. Early on June 3rd, Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton set out from Hanover Courthouse north of Richmond with 180 dragoons from his own legion, horsemen armed and drilled to also fight dismounted, augmented by 70 mounted infantrymen from the 23rd Regiment Royal Welsh Fusiliers. These improvised horsemen, foot soldiers atop horseflesh stolen from the Virginia countryside, rode with their light muskets slung across their red tunics. Tarleton wrote that he planned a march of 70 miles in 24 hours. That's really, really ambitious. Because the weather was exceedingly warm, however, the going was slow. Tarleton's column, in fact, took up most of the first day to reach Cuckoo Tavern, a distance of 30 miles. The average a horseman could expect to travel in one day. In order to bag his game, however, Tarleton was pushing his men to cover more. Jack Jouett watched the enemy raiders trot past Cuckoo Tavern. Disregarding his own safety, the Virginian was immediately concerned for his country and his country's government. Fortunately, his bay mare Sally, supposedly the fleetest steed in 7 counties, supposedly, good old Sally, was nearby in the tavern's paddock. Quickly donning his riding boots, scarlet coat, and military hat and plume, according to Jefferson biographer Henry S. Randall, Jouett was soon cantering down the highway at a safe distance behind Tarleton's column. Somehow he had to beat them to Monticello and Charlottesville. It was a dangerous proposition, no doubt, and Jouett had no way of knowing if anyone else was similarly engaged on that moonlit night. If he was indeed acting alone, the Old Dominion's fate was resting on the evening's visibility, remember, moonlit, and Jouett's knowledge of the wilderness trails. Providence could not have selected a better messenger. Okay, so I know this is really hard to see, but this is, believe it or not, this is actually a map that I illustrated 50 years ago. And one is where Tarleton departed. 2 is approximately Cuckoo Tavern. 3 is where Jouett turned off of the road to get down to the 3-notch road, and then of course 4 is the gap in the mountain at Pantos. Born in Albemarle County on December 7th, 1754, the 26-year-old Jack Jouett Jr. has often been described as intelligent, resourceful, daring, and brave. He was also a strapping young fella. He stood 4 feet 6 inches tall. But wait, there's more. And weighed 220 pounds. So taller than me and 50 pounds heavier.
You said 4'6". You mean 6'4"?
What did I say?
You said
Oh, 6'4", I'm sorry. Thank you. If he was 4'6" and 220 pounds, he'd basically be a plum. Thank you. 6'4". Thank you. I'm not going to live that down, am I? Unfortunately, little is known of his early days. He was the son of a tavern owner, and indeed, the running of wayside taverns, a lucrative business in the days when friendly stopping places were few, seems to have been in the Jouett family blood. In 1742, Jack's grandfather, Matthew Jouett, had opened an ordinary in his house near present-day Louisa. Matthew's son, John Jouett Sr., Jack's father, had once been the owner of Cuckoo Tavern itself. After selling that establishment in 1773, Jouett Sr. purchased 100 acres adjoining Charlottesville on the east and north, and at that time most likely erected the Swan Tavern of famous memory. That quote from Edgar Woods, really Albemarle County's first serious historian. During the Revolution, the father acted as a commissary, selling considerable beef and other needed supplies to the quartermasters of the Continental Army. Patriotism, evidently, was also a dominant trait in this French Huguenot family. Interesting. Revere, French Huguenot family. Jouett, French Huguenot family. Pretty interesting. Although the standard story, here come maybe some busted bubbles here. The standard story that Jack, according to Virginia Stabney, was a captain in the Virginia militia, as were his 3 brothers. That story, Matthew, Robert, and Charles, that doesn't hold up under examination. A search of the state's militia records revealed no Captain John Jouett. Instead, one of the early accounts, Henry S. Randall's 1858 biography of Jefferson, referred to Jack as a showy gentleman who was no officer, but had an eccentric custom of wearing military-style getup. Keep that in mind. 2 brothers, however, were captains in the Virginia Continental line, the regular army at the time. Older brother Matthew in the 7th Virginia, he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Brandywine, and Robert in Colonel James Woods's 12th Virginia. With 2 Jouetts serving in the Continental Army, Jack and his father evidently felt compelled to make a political statement. In June of 1779, both signed the curious Albemarle Declaration of Independence. Remember, this is in 79, which stated in part that we renounce all allegiance to George III and will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Virginia as a free and independent state. Freedom and independence were certainly at stake as Jouett, an excellent horseman, trotted in the wake of Tarleton's troopers. Moving cautiously once he neared the courthouse, Louisa Courthouse that is, Jouett could see dimly the dragoons moving about. The raiders had halted to water their horses. Polished buttons and especially metal-sheathed sabers reflected under the bright moonlight. Tarleton wrote that he had halted at 11 near Louisa Courthouse and remained on a plentiful plantation until 2 a.m. The best road blocked, Jouett turned Sally into an abandoned road by way of which the logs for the courthouse had been brought. He knew the trail well, having hunted along it. In the 18th century, this might surprise a whole lot of people, but in the 18th century, Central Virginia was not a region crisscrossed by numerous well-maintained roads. Hint, hint. 3 of the best trails running east to west through the dense wilderness, in fact, were that being used by the British, the Mountain Road, today's 2233, and to its south, across the South Anna River, the Old Mountain Road, or modern 640. Just to the south, on a parallel track, ran the area's best east-west highway, the Three Notch Road, also known, of course, as Three Chopped Road, leading from Richmond to the Shenandoah, approximately today's 250. To best outstrip Tarleton, therefore, Jouett headed southwestward toward the trail whose famous signposts, trees bearing 3 hatchet chops like chevrons, would thereafter guide him to Charlottesville. This meant traversing logging trails and seldom used cow paths. His progress was greatly impeded by matted undergrowth, tangled brush, overhanging vines, and gullies. His face was cruelly lashed by tree limbs as he rode forward, and scars said to have remained the rest of his life were the result of lacerations sustained from those low-hanging branches. Drenched with sweat, I think I'm getting behind on the pictures here. Oh, okay. Drenched with sweat, Jouett and Sally splashed into the South Anna, somewhere south of Louisa Courthouse. Perhaps he stopped briefly to water Sally, and perhaps even washed off her flanks, now covered with scratches. Soon he was back in the saddle. He could judge by the position of the moon that the night was far spent, causing him to travel faster. He was determined to beat Tarleton or die in the effort. Within a few miles, Jouett stumbled into the Old Mountain Road. Here he guided Sally to the right, toward the mountains. 7 or 8 miles later, both horse and rider, suffering from exertion and thirst, entered Three Notch Road. Speaking of thirst, for some reason I'm really parched. Heading west along this well-marked byway, Jouett spurred Sally to even greater efforts. They still had over 15 miles to go. Tarleton's force was on the move again at 2 a.m. Before daylight, the marauders captured and burned 12 wagons bearing weapons and clothing for the Continental Army. Just after daybreak, rode Tarleton. Some of the principal gentlemen of Virginia who had fled to the mountains for security were taken out of their beds. At Castle Hill, the estate of Dr. Thomas Walker, discoverer of the Cumberland Gap into Kentucky, the British cavalrymen rested for half an hour. This brief stopover, and we'll talk some more afterwards, but this brief stopover has been the subject of numerous tall tales. All involve an elaborate delaying breakfast. None of these stories should be believed, however. Tarleton would not have fallen for such an obvious ruse. And ask me about it, we'll talk about it some more. He was in a hurry. Nearby, a member of the Continental Congress, Francis Kinloch, was captured. Crossing the Rivanna at Milton, Jouett ascended Monticello Mountain 3 weary miles later. Let's see if we got it. There's Castle Hill. There's Walker on that expedition to the Cumberland Gap. So he ascends the mountain, Monticello Mountain. It was 4:30, a little before sunrise, according to Randall. Alerted, Jefferson's guests, members of the assembly, plus the speakers of both houses, breakfasted at leisure, then proceeded to Charlottesville. Legend has it that Jefferson offered up a glass of fortifying Madeira when Jouett remounted to spread the alarm. Jefferson, however, was unhurried. Perhaps it was because his ill-fated governorship had ended 2 days later. This meant, of course, that at the moment, Virginia had no chief executive. After sending off his family and carefully organizing his papers, Jefferson was warned again of the British approach before he finally galloped up the adjoining wooded slope. He was mere minutes ahead of Loyalist dragoons under Captain Kenneth MacLeod. Jefferson later referred to this extremely troubling episode, the so-called Affair of Carter's Mountain, as the very nadir, the bottom of his political career. Randall wrote that 2 of Jefferson's slaves, Martin and Caesar, were left at Monticello and were engaged in secreting plate and other valuables under the planked floor of the front portico when MacLeod's party arrived. Just as the last piece of silver was handed down to Caesar in the cavity, Martin either heard the hoofbeats or saw the Loyalists through the trees, and down went the plank, shutting Caesar in the dark hole below. There he remained, without light or food, until MacLeod's troopers departed many hours later. And I'm not being specific there because the accounts vary as to how long MacLeod tarried at Monticello. Like Charlottesville, little Charlottesville in the meantime was a blur of activity. Warned by Jouett, the assemblymen quickly convened and decided to meet again 3 days later in Stanton, 40 miles to the west. Very smart. Then they scattered. After dispatching MacLeod to Monticello, Tarleton charged through a small militia force at Secretary's Ford, then thundered onto Courthouse Square to apprehend, if possible, the governor and the assembly. Most of the flock, of course, had flown. 7 members of the assembly were secured, wrote Tarleton, neglecting to list their names. The kind of thing that drives people like me absolutely crazy. And several officers and men were killed, wounded, or taken. During their one-day stay, the British discovered a great quantity of stores and destroyed 1,000 firelocks, upwards of 400 barrels of gunpowder, and several hogsheads of tobacco. Jack Jouett's other activities that morning are difficult to sort out. Randall wrote that Brigadier General Edward Stevens, wounded in battle and now serving in the legislature, was able to elude British dragoons because he was dressed as a Virginia farmer and mounted on a shabby horse. Mr. Jouett, however, thanks to his ersatz military attire, was more attractive game, so the enemy took off after him instead. After Jouett had coquetted with his pursuers long enough, he gave Sally the spur, and speedily he was out of sight. So remember that story. Daniel Boone, representing the Eastern District of the Western Virginia County of Kentucky, was among the legislators in Charlottesville that day. Nathan Boone, Daniel's youngest son, related the following 70 years later. When Jack Jouett gave notice of Tarleton's approach, my father, Daniel Boone, remained, loading up on wagons the public records. When they were overtaken by the British, questioned hastily and dismissed. But then Jouett called out, "Wait a minute, Captain Boone, and I'll go with you." An enemy officer within earshot asked, he's a captain, is he? And took Boone into custody. Conveyed to the British camp east of town and held overnight in a coal house, the legendary frontiersman was reportedly interrogated by Tarleton and released. The two stories are difficult to square. They're contradictory. One has Jouett completely overlooked by the British, despite shooting off his mouth at the courthouse, while the other has him racing away from Charlottesville because his military garb makes him more noticeable. You see how those two things are completely at odds? Did either of these events take place? We'll probably never know. What we do know is this. On June 15th, 1781, just 2 weeks later, the assemblymen resolved that Jouett should receive, quote, an elegant sword and pair of pistols as a memorial of the high sense which the General Assembly entertained of his activity and enterprise. After all, thanks to Jouett's 40-mile ride, 4 signers of the Declaration of Independence escaped capture: Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Harrison, Richard Henry Lee, and Thomas Nelson Jr. A who's who of Virginia history. This extraordinary list comprises a future president, Jefferson of course, the father of another future president, Harrison, whose son William Henry was elected in 1840, and the man who next became Virginia's governor, Thomas Nelson. Patrick Henry was also among the escapees, as was the father of John Tyler Jr., who followed William Henry Harrison into the White House. Jack Jouett got the pistols in 1783, but his receipt of the sword was delayed 20 years. Virginia government in action. By that time, he'd made quite a name for himself out on the frontier. Jouett had managed Swan Tavern for a spell. Then, like thousands of other Virginians, he lit out for Kentucky in 1782. 2 years later, he married Sally Robards, a relative of Andrew Jackson's wife. The couple had 12 children. A football team and a substitute. In 1787 and again in 1790, according to Lewis Collins, Jouett represented his region of Kentucky in the Virginia General Assembly. The year Kentucky gained statehood, 1792, Jouett was elected to represent Mercer County in the new state legislature. 3 years later, he represented Woodford County. Jouett was an agricultural leader as well. He imported livestock in large numbers and thus helped the bluegrass state achieve its cattle and horse breeding fame. In Kentucky, Jack Jouett is remembered as a high liver, a man full of humor and fun. Remarkable for his hospitality, Jouett was the associate and companion of all the great men of early Kentucky. He was a man of note in his day. Jack Jouett died at Peeled Oak, his Bath County, Kentucky farm on February 21st, 1822. He was buried in the nearby family cemetery where, unfortunately, all the stones have been lost. Yeah. Somehow, to me, this seems fitting. Jack Jouett, the Central Virginia patriot whose early life and heroic deed have been lost to history, now lies lost out on the Kentucky frontier. He's still very much a mystery. Thank you.